Okay, so today's presentation is building on what we covered yesterday, but going more into the technicalities, logistics, giving you a more of a concrete idea of what we're actually going to be doing together over the next 12 months. So for that reason, I would suggest that if you don't already have something around you to take notes or something to write down, that might be helpful for today's session, just as we cover some of these details. But let's go ahead and jump in. So open source mentorship, what to expect. Hopefully you haven't forgotten already that open source is a method, a movement, and also a culture. Very important, and you'll probably hear me say that many more times over the next few months as well. But for today's session, we're going to go a little bit more into the details of what the next 12 months will look like, some of the content and modules that we'll cover as you build your open source strategy, and then in terms of next steps, what you can look forward or what you can look for in the next couple of weeks as we get started with the open source mentorship. So with that, let's go ahead and start with talking about what is this whole open source mentorship program. So this is something that is really unique and is provided by the Innovation Fund, and it's a unique perk and a strategic asset that you have in extension of being a UNICEF investee. So over the next 12 months, I'm your assigned open source mentor, and we'll be working together to think about how we build business strategy, build ways, just like we talked yesterday about building that house, how we'll be doing that over the next 12 months. We'll be going into those details of actually building the foundation, the structures, the entry points, and even doing that interior decorating. So the point of this part of the presentation is we're going to look a little bit more in terms of who you want to have around in these conversations and what kinds of topics we'll be covering. So to give you an idea of what the first 6 months look like, this is really targeted towards more of the business and engineering strategy sides of your team. So for these first 6 months, it's usually important that we have folks who either are the CEOs or founders or CTOs or people that have decision-making around technology in the team that are a part of these calls. Because most of what we're doing in the first half of the mentorship program is really talking about strategy and making sure that those foundations and structures are rock solid, that we can rely on them as we move forward, and that your business model and your open source pieces will be aligned together. So that's why we'll be doing a lot of those kinds of conversations in the first 6 months. And by the end of this period, the executive leadership team should have a better understanding of how open source enables innovation. And by that point, all the teams should be working in public repositories by the end of those 6 months. Many of you will probably get there sooner, or maybe some of you already are. That's totally fine too, but no later than then, everyone will have public repos and you'll be doing your work in the open. So when you look at the second tail, the second half of the mentorship program, this is when we tend to get a little more into the details and into the technicalities of how we actually set up your projects and tools we can use and processes and things to add that actually make it easier for folks to participate and get involved. So things that we'll often talk about here is building a documentation website and how to set up a testing and continuous integration pipeline, really practicing that pull request workflow and more. And by the end of this part of the mentorship program, the technical team should have a better understanding of how to carry out their work in a way that's compatible with the open source method. So this is where I'll introduce one of these really helpful resources that I touched on very briefly yesterday, but I want to mention again that we have this open source inventory that was created as part of the Innovation Fund. And this is a key resource that will be provided to you. And it's also a forever resource. You will always have access to this. It is a public open source knowledge base of best practices and resources. So much of the content that we have here has been contributed either by experts or has come out of directly working with previous Innovation Fund teams. So a lot of the information that you'll find here is extremely tailored towards or written with innovation fund startups and companies in mind. It's still a useful resource in many different ways, but this is one that during the mentorship, you'll find, I'll probably refer you out to a specific article. There's some guides and walkthroughs that are in here. So you'll see this open source inventory come up a lot as we start to build the open source house together over the next few months. So highlighting that as one thing that will be available for you, but maybe to better understand what exactly we'll be covering, we can look at the 5 key modules that we'll be looking at during this next 12 months to build your open source strategy. So the first module that we'll look at, which will be most of the first few months that we're working together, we're looking at legal and licensing, really trying to build that solid foundation of open source intellectual property for your projects. So as I've said once before, and I will say many times again, open source is like building a house. And this stage is all about setting those solid foundations and making sure that things like the licenses that you've chosen are part of that solid foundation that align with your business strategy. So this module will introduce the open source definition, the types of open source licenses, and how to be strategic and intentional with your choice of licenses, as well as topics around copyright, trademark, and how you manage these things in an open source context. So, the open source licenses are the legal foundation, the legal framework of your project. And by the end of this module, you should have a stronger understanding of what the limits and bounds of your open source license choice are and how those impact the rules of your business model. So yeah, some of the specific things that we look at: licenses, the open source definition, trademarks, business strategy. So these will be the things we're going into in the most short term, starting as early as this month. Once we get through that more strategic side and looking at more of the framework of how we'll do what we do, we'll actually start building out and launching your open source project. So at this point, you will have a licensing strategy. You'll have some thoughts in place about your trademarks and how you manage those things. So this module is where we'll start to introduce open source forges, or the places that you do your work, and how these collaboration platforms can be used most effectively. So you'll learn how to use those tools, and we'll also think of ways to structure your project in order to scale with a community over time. So this module is for early stage open source projects that are still in that active early development stage, still building out an early solution. And by the end of this module, you'll understand common open source development workflows, how to enable collaboration with advanced features of your source code platform, and a few other things as well. So some specific line items from this module. We'll talk about brand and identity, the Git repos, the pull request workflow, your READMEs, and a little bit on public project management. Once we have kind of launched or soft launched the open source project, then we start to look at the documentation piece. And if everyone knew a programming language in the world, maybe source code alone would be enough. But most people don't know a programming language or anything about blockchain. Maybe that'll be different for some of your clients and users, but most people don't have a deep knowledge of these concepts. And so that's where documentation is a really effective tool of how you build community and include other people on your rocket ship to building your product. So this module will introduce some common tools and platforms that are used for open source documentation, how to build an automated pipeline to deploy new documentation in real time, thinking about how to build a documentation culture and community in your project, and finally, looking at creating some of that structure that will enable external contributions to the documentation. By the end of this module, your project will have an open source documentation website published on the internet and you'll have a plan on how to maintain this site over time. So this module is really for any open source project at any stage that wants to improve their documentation skills and invite other people to collaborate and contribute. We place it right in the middle of the open source mentorship program because it's a nice transition point in between that early stage soft launch of your project and starting to bring in more folks into your community. So some specific examples, what we'll be talking about in detail here: automation, contribution guidelines, creating documentation for both developers and users, and looking at some of the tool chains that you can use to actually build out that documentation. The fourth module that we'll go through is continuous integration for continuous contribution. As in life, open source projects will change over time. And as you manage those new changes to the source code of a project, how do you verify that those new changes do not break existing code or existing work? You can spend that time by manually validating changes and testing them out locally, but you can also automate it. And you can use workflow automation tools to help take some of that labor off of your team and let folks work on the issues that really need human attention the most. So this module will introduce continuous integration and continuous deployment in an open source context. By the end of the module, your project will have a working CI/CD pipeline for your open source repositories, and new changes to the repos will be validated against a basic set of tests, depending on what kind of software you're building and how it's structured. We'll get into those details when we're working on that module together. But this module is, again, for any open source project at any stage that wants to improve code quality, code health, and just saving time from that manual testing and validation work. So examples of specific topics here, like I kind of just said most of these things, but the CI/CD platforms, code testing, automated deployments, the pull request workflow, or really extending that pull request workflow to CI and CD, looking at code health tools. And finally, the last module we'll get into together before we end our time together with the open source mentorship program is Archetypes, which is a way to help understand the shape and size of open source over time. So going back to that house metaphor, before you can invite people into your open source house, you need that solid foundation that you can build your community on. And by completing those previous modules, at this point, your project will be primed for working with new contributors. And this more reflective module will look at some existing resources around understanding what the open source ecosystem looks like and creating a theory of change that would apply to your open source work. So by the end of this module, you'll have an understanding of what the different forms an open source project and community may take. And you will also be able to identify where your project falls and make some predictions on where you'll go next. So this one is for any project that's looking to anticipate growth, change, or evolution to its code and its community over time. So yeah, this one is definitely more of a reflective one. It won't be as hands-on into tools and platforms, but we'll look at defining what your archetype is, aligning and how to align some of your future steps to that strategy we've mapped out towards the very beginning. So that brings us into the last part of this presentation, which is going to be a little more in the logistics and miscellaneous details, but still important content to cover. We'll try to make this not too boring, but the batteries included approach for mentorship is you'll have two formats for mentorship through the next 12 months. And one form of that will be through direct support over audio and video calls, and the other will be self-serve resources that help you better understand how to work and lead open, like the open source inventory I talked about earlier. So for those direct support with audio video calls, we'll have some personalized meetings. Once a month, we'll have a 60-minute check-in where we look together at discussion items from a previous meeting, if any, looking at what the next 1 to 2 months looks like for your project, and then coming up with some concrete next steps to take to actually get you there. Additionally, if you need additional support or guidance or mentorship, every team can request up to 2 times a month to have an ad hoc 30-minute meeting. So let's talk a little bit more about what these look like. So the monthly check-ins, yeah, once a month in an hour-long meeting. I kind of said most of these things actually, but yeah, just thinking again that we're really trying to look back on what you've accomplished over the last month, where your team and your project is now, and then trying to think ahead to what your next steps will be. And that first meeting that we'll have, I'm in the process of setting up the invites for your first mentorship call. This first one will run 90 minutes just because we're getting to know each other for the first time. We'll be talking about your open source strategy, and it'll mostly be a time for us to learn a little bit more about each other. For the ad hoc chats, these 30-minute ones, right, so you can request these up to twice a month. Really, these are going to be a chance to get more personalized, direct support on a specific or one or two clearly scoped topics. So to request these, you just have to reach out to me over email and let me know a preferred and an alternate date and time that are available for you to meet. So if all of this was kind of an information overload, which was a lot more text heavy than my presentation was yesterday, no worries. You can find this all on reference in a Google Doc at the link that's on the bottom of the slide. And you can find this recapped in the same way, just in maybe an easier to reference format as well, if you ever have any questions on this. So this was a really speed run presentation today. I don't think we'll take the full hour, but now is a good chance that if you have any immediate questions around what we're actually going to be doing over the next few months, or better understanding what those steps will look like, now is a great time to ask those questions. And I'll go ahead and open up the chat here. Oh, just seeing about the volume. Hopefully it wasn't too soft volume. I'll put the link here to the slides in the chat. If I can copy it, just slightly off screen here.
Justin.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Rajat with Rumsan. So something you mentioned yesterday about setting up the goals and objectives of doing the whole open source. So we're planning to do a brainstorming session tonight, just within the C-suite and some of the product managers at Rumsan, to go through the, to come up with basic objectives and basic goals of why we're doing open sourcing. Just get our heads together. Do you recommend that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. What can you be doing in the meantime while we get these first chats set up? So the best conversations you can start having with your team, and the best way to prepare for that first call, is really going to be understanding your own why and your own purpose. One of the things that we'll talk about in that early stage, and actually probably one of the very first things we'll also talk about, along with copyright and trademark, we're also going to talk about creating a project vision statement and mission statement, and also a community statement. All of these things are going to be helping us frame, why are you doing what you're doing in this open source way? And how are these pieces aligned? So the best conversations you can have in the meantime, until we first get connected, is really trying to understand your own motivations and purposes, and thinking about, what are the things that you'd like to try to get out of the open source? And what are the things that you think you could also contribute back? Because it's often that bi-directional feedback loop. So, and it might be that some of these things, I'd rather you be as, think big and think as broad as you want. And then when we come into that first call, we can start to scope things and think through, like, well, here's some of the challenges, or here's some of those, what goes into these things. But what will help us the most in that first chat is just to have an idea of what your own goals are for open source, or what you think your own goals are, at least for now. Maybe that'll change. That's okay. I'm not asking for fixed, that you have to spend hours and hours of research time on this, but just come with an idea of what you think open source is all about and how you think that will work for your products. And that'll help us make the most of our time in that first meeting. Does that answer the question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Super. Anyone else? I see there's some questions coming in here on the chat as well.
Yes, Justin, this is Ravi here from India, UNICEF.
Yes,
I have a
go ahead.
question here. Suppose if there is a product or a project which has already been coded and it has been launched, and again, there is an enhanced version which has been built. And how do we open source it, like which is already built, not from the scratch?
Yeah, so when you're coming in from something that's already built, you have to do a lot of these same processes, and maybe even in the same order that I shared in the module, but it gets more complicated because you'll often have more stakeholders and more people that are already a part of the process. So when you're looking at, in this, going back to that house metaphor, you're building those foundations, the legal and policy and process groundwork of your project, you're often going to have a little bit more time that you have to spend in building consensus around these things and being able to make sure you're bringing in the right people at the right time for which part of the conversation you're at. So it's really hard in the case where you already have an existing product and it's maybe at a more mature state. A lot of those times, if you already have a big user base or you have many stakeholders who have been a part of that creation process, it's a matter of finding the right group of folks to involve in those early stage decisions around licensing and maybe even creating your own mission and vision statement for these kinds of things. But I really would just summarize it best as the same kind of work, just different timelines. And those timelines will depend on who is a part of your project and the work today, and how many barriers there might be for you to make that change to move to an open framework later. Does that answer the question, Ravi?
Yes, Justin, it did. Thank you very much.
Super. And I saw there was a raised hand somewhere. Juan? I see you unmuted, but I cannot hear anything. Not sure if it's just on my side. I see that you're unmuted, but I don't hear it now. I see you're muted again. We'll come back and see if the audio, we can fix the audio. If not, feel free to put your question in the chat and I'll answer it there. Salathiel, I see you have your hand up as well.
Yes, thank you, Justin. This is Salathiel from India. I just have a question, like, as you know that we have a product which is already there, and then as you rightly said that it is a bit complicated to take it forward. Now, what I want to know is that, there are several processes and frameworks, licenses, and so many things which are involved in that. Now, like I'm just thinking whether we need a dedicated human resource for making this as a open source product, maybe in the coming 12 months. And I just want to know how much time somebody has to put on this, and then what, like some of the people like me will be joining the sessions to get knowledge and then give direction, but somebody need to actually sit and work on this for some time. So how much time it takes, and then what do you suggest for us? Thank you.
That's a great question. So I have a complicated answer for that, but I'll try to give you one concrete idea of what can be really helpful in this case. And the complicated part of that answer is it always depends on the project and who's involved and who those stakeholders are. So in terms of how much time, I can't put a day or month. It could even be, depending on what scale you're operating at, that timeline can move. But in terms of the kind of skills you look at as you get to more of that mature stage. So like one thing that we'll end up talking about in the open source mentorship program with this blockchain cohort is thinking about things like who is on your team and being able to bring in the right skills and talent. So oftentimes we are maybe a little more biased to thinking of engineering resources and the programming side and the code side of things. But you also have things like a community management aspect. So having someone whose entire focus or responsibilities are around engaging and interacting with the community and making sure that that community is feeling involved and a part of that project community is really important. Having people like technical writers can be a really important skill as well, because if there's anything that open source maybe lacks, has a big deficit of, its documentation. Being able to take those open source works and understand how they work and doing that writing in an organized way. So I think the most important thing is really actually a human resources question there, is making sure that while it's hard for me to say, like, there's no one size fits all model here for how many people or how long your timelines are here, generally you are going to need a pretty intersectional team to get an open source project up and running and off the ground. You might be able to rely mostly on those engineering resources in the beginning phases, but as you make that transition towards open, which this is also one of the reasons why we like to start open as early as possible, because that's where we have the most flexibility. But I realize that's not always a choice we always get to make. So when we don't have that flexibility, I think it's just important to make sure that we're thinking about the kinds of skills and talent that we might have for other kinds of technology projects, and then thinking about how those would look like in an open source way. That's one reason why we look at open source documentation in the third module of the open source mentorship program. And if you're at a point where you can bring in technical writers, or if you already have technical writers, that's a great point to bring those folks in and align them in that part of the conversation. Does that help answer your question there?
Yeah. So what you're suggesting is that it requires a multi-skill team, and it takes like a little bit of longer time, or team has to work together, putting all different skills into making this as an open source software, right?
You got it. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
So I noticed a couple of questions in the chat here. I'm going to circle back to first one from Amir. We are already open source and we have done most of the steps. And what I want to know is how to engage developers to contribute on our project. Well, knowing what most of the steps are, I think that's something that this is probably a question that will better be answered in that first mentorship chat, because that's when we'll have a chance to really, well, I'll have a chance to better understand what steps you've already taken and where your specific product is in terms of this timeline. So, if the case that, well, hey, maybe you've done all of these really, early stage things, you already have that all figured out and you're ready to go. Well, then we can look at some of the things that are more focused around outreach and around trying to build that identity, and how you can not just build your own community, get contributors into your project, but also thinking how you participate in that ecosystem. How maybe there's things that where other places you contribute or other places you get involved that have a strategic angle to your work. So that's one that, it's a good question, but we'll have a better chance to answer that one in that first onboarding call later this month that we'll have. I hope that answers your question. You can let me know in the chat. I see I've got a thumbs up there. So jump to Juan's question my question is about the tech stack. Is UNICEF encouraging to use specific tools, or is that up to us? So that's a great question. And I've always been on the side of erring in choosing the tools that make the most sense for you and your team. So of course, there are other platforms out there. And actually, I am a fan of GitLab, not just because it's open source, but also they have a really amazing set of DevOps tools and continuous integration, continuous deployment. We'll have a chance to nerd out on some of those things in the conversation, but let's say you're already set up on GitHub, or that's where you want to work, that is totally fine. And what really matters is there's two parts: that whatever you're building is publicly visible, that it's not private, and you're distributing it with an open source license. That's the part we want to make sure that you're doing right. Oh, awesome. So you're GitLab fans too. Well, maybe we'll have a chance to jump into some of those tools during the open source mentorship side as well. But great question. And the answer is, I'm always in favor of teams using the tools that make the most sense for their own contexts and where you're at in the development process. So I think that was all the questions from the chat. I'll just take a look here to see if there's any more raised hands, but I'm not seeing any. So in that case, if there are no further questions, we can go ahead and wrap up here.